Hello and welcome to episode 11 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to Dr. Freddie Attenborough, communications officer at the Free Speech Union, on the Labour government's chilling social media crackdown in the wake of the Southport riots.
Rioting is not a new phenomenon. It doesn't run concurrently with social media.
Andy Collingwood, writer and co-host of the Multipolarity Podcast, on why the left's claim that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants is just pure gaslighting.
If you look at the genetic record of Britain, about 3/4 of modern-day Britons were here 6,000 years ago.
David Turver, author of the Eigen Values substack, on how Britain's government of net zero-fanatic humanities graduates are running our economy into the ground.
There's 6 new ministers in the department. Not a single one of them has got any background in science or engineering or maths, and almost all of them have worked in the public sector for their whole lives.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with CJ Strachan, the Daily Sceptic's resident HR expert and the founder of Fair Job, on the anti-white employment discrimination at Thames Valley Police.
It has some serious questions around what exactly is going on at this police force and what exactly is going on in a lot of our public sector institutions.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, after the brutal killing of 3 young girls in Southport earlier this month, the riots that followed have been met with a wave of arrests. Sir Keir Starmer's government has promised a crackdown. And to free up space in our crowded prison system, 2,000 prisoners are due to be given early release in September, with more to follow. Some of those now taking their place behind bars are guilty of serious violent disorder. Some, however, have done little more than comment on the riots online. One 53-year-old woman with no prior criminal record, Julie Sweeney, the sole carer to her 72-year-old husband, has been jailed for 15 months for a single intemperate Facebook post. Now, is that justice? And what about free speech? Well, to answer those questions, I'm very pleased to be joined now by Dr. Freddie Attenborough, Communications Officer at the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Freddie.
Welcome.
So, Freddie, you're an expert in this, but for those who don't know, what are the different laws we have on the books in Britain that mean someone can go to jail for posting something online?
I think it all kind of crystallises around this idea. We often talk about it, but this idea of hate speech. There's actually no one legal definition of hate speech. What we tend to mean is communication and speech that promotes or incites violence against particular individuals or groups. So there tends to be, at least in the UK and most other nation states at the moment, there tends to be this idea of a public order element. So for something to be hate speech, it can't just, or in theory, it can't just be something that somebody finds upsetting. There has to be a public order element, the idea that there's a promotion or incitement of violence. But I think in that sort of field of hate speech, there's definitely a hierarchy. And I think obviously at the top of that hierarchy of offences would be glorified terrorism, harassment, cyber stalking. I don't think there's really free speech elements to those issues at all. Where we get into this really interesting area is around offences like, for instance, Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003. One of the offences that law creates is the sending of, quote, grossly offensive messages via a public electronic communication system. So that's a textual message. And the thing about this is that grossly offensive, what does that mean? It's a very subjective thing. Some of the other offences created by the Communications Act 2003, Section 127, menacing communications, obscene communications. Well, most of us can probably agree what a definition of that would be, but grossly offensive, that's taking us into the realm of subjective perceptions and possibly politicized ideas of what is simply ideologically offensive to some people. So the other thing I'd say about the Communications Act 2003, Section 127, is that the offence is created simply by the sending of the message. So there doesn't have to be a recipient that is offended. So it's simply the act of sending something that can be viewed as grossly offensive by the courts. That's enough. So even WhatsApp messages, and I know that Laurie, you've written about this in the past, that we're finding that even WhatsApp messages that are sent in a private chat group can be subject to Section 127 of the Communications Act. I mean, I'm sure we'll come to this in a moment. There's obviously the Online Safety Act, which is partially in force at the moment. There's still some provisions that are yet to come in. Public Order Act 1986, with protests, for instance, the CPS will charge people under Section 4A of the Public Order Act 1986, and that's the offence of causing, quote, harassment, alarm, or distress by the display of a sign or any visual representation that can be considered threatening and therefore likely to cause harassment, alarm, or distress to a particular individual or a group. Finally, there's a lot else we could talk about, but the other thing about the Public Order Act 1986 is it creates stirring up hatred offences. And at the moment, the stirring up hatred offences are based on religion, race, and sexual orientation. Now, in Scotland, obviously, this was broadened recently with the draconian Scottish Hate Crime Act, and it broadened the stirring up hatred offences to include any form of hatred directed to people who were transgender identity, disabled, people with age became a protected characteristic as well, and also variations in sex characteristics. So this, again, very, very dangerously vague and subjective stirring up hatred offence is now being broadened, has been broadened in Scotland to include a whole load of other characteristics. Once you start including transgender identity in there, of course, that pulls potentially within the realm of criminalisation gender critical thought. People who believe that sex is immutable and biological, is that now stirring up hatred if you say that publicly, and so on and so. So those are the fears around that. And one of the things at the Free Speech Union that we're worried about is that the Hate Crime Act may be coming down the track in Westminster. Labour may be planning their own Hate Crime Act to broaden out the Public Order Act 1986 offences for England. So that's a whistle-stop tour of some of the, if you might say, the lowlights of online communications offences that people can be prosecuted under.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, one of the bizarre things about this web of laws is that people can be treated more seriously by the law for posting something online that nobody even reads than for actually doing something physically violent in person. Now, in connection with the Southport riots, what are some of the most egregious examples of this that people should know about?
So far, one of the most egregious cases is a 55-year-old woman from Southport who was arrested by Cheshire Police, held in custody for 36 hours, and has been released pending further investigation. And her crime was to tweet. She tweeted very early about the identity of the murderer in the Southport stabbings, and she tweeted falsely. She made the incorrect claim that the Southport stabbings were committed by a Muslim asylum seeker who had come to the UK on a boat and was on an MI6 watch list. Now, this was false, and we now know that this was false. The mitigating factor, there are a number of mitigating factors. One of them is that she's claiming that this was something she was simply passing on from another news site, and the other mitigating factor is that she prefaced this tweet with the message, "If this is true." So she said, "If this is true, all hell will break loose." So that's in legal terms, I'd imagine that's quite an important qualifying clause to say if this is true. The other thing, of course, is that she deleted it as soon as she became aware of the facts of the matter, which it was a false claim. I'd point out that the now Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions in 2013, he issued some eminently sensible guidance, CPS, Crown Prosecution Service guidance, about about the prosecution of online communication offences. And his whole rationale in that guidance was that there needs to be a high threshold for prosecution of online offences, and a lot of offences would be more sensibly dealt with an apology and a swift removal of the online post in question, and that we needed to balance the offence with the protections that people have under Article 10. So the same Director of Public Prosecutions is now the Prime Minister, and we've got a case here with this 55-year-old woman. She's been one of the charges she's had is under the Online Safety Act, and we'll come on to that. But her case would seem to be one where her treatment is far too heavy-handed for the actions that she committed. And at the Free Speech Union, we're continuing to support and assist her. I think it'd be extremely unlikely that she's going to be charged, but if she is, we've offered to pay for her legal costs,
and a good thing too. Okay, so we've spoken about the Online Safety Act there, and that's another thing that we can thank the Tories for bringing in. But how is that adding to the climate of intolerance for speech online?
Yeah, so I mean, I think probably the case of the 55-year-old woman in Cheshire who was arrested for this offence of falsely communicating information about the identity of the Southport attacker. The offence there is under the Online Safety Act, Section 179. There's a false communications offence, and that is the offence that she has allegedly committed. So just to get this right, because the wording here is crucial. So Section 179 of the False Communications Act. So just to get this right, the wording here is crucial. So Section 179 of the Online Safety Act, false communications offence, is knowingly sending false communications and intending to cause, quote, non-trivial psychological or physical harm. So non-trivial psychological or physical harm to a, quote, likely audience. So there's a whole host of issues there about where is the threshold for trivial versus non-trivial psychological harm. But I think one of the questions in the case that we're dealing with at the moment about the false information that was sent about the Southport attacker via Twitter is, at what point do linguistic markers like, if this is true, or I've heard that this might be true, but I'm not sure, or this is what people are saying. At what point are we going to say that actually that was knowingly sending a false communication? And at what point are we going to be saying actually that's a good faith attempt to join a public discussion? I think those are really important issues, and I think it's not going to be the first time that people are going to get caught under this false communications offence in the same way that our member has been caught recently. I mean, and then the other issue is, like I said, non-trivial psychological, physical harm. I mean, what does that mean, and what could that mean? We now live in a culture where if you believe and you adhere to critical race theory, then microaggressions, a white person blinking their eyes or raising their eyelids in the wrong moment during a meeting can be a microaggression, which they would argue is deeply traumatic, psychologically traumatic to the recipient of that microaggression. I'm not saying there's a direct read across to the Online Safety Act, but that's the culture in which judges and the legal system is going to have to define what non-trivial psychological harm means, and that's going to be a real issue for people who believe in the importance of free speech.
So one of the things we talked about last time, and in fact that we've spoken a lot about at The Sceptic, is the fact that a Labour government might pose a serious threat to free speech in Britain. And of course, we've seen the Director of Public Prosecutions, which in fact is Keir Starmer's previous job, issuing this sort of very vague and broad threat about the kinds of speech online that could get people in trouble.
The offence of incitement to racial hatred involves publishing or distributing material which is insulting or abusive, which is intended to or likely to start racial hatred. So if you retweet that, then you're republishing that, and then potentially you're committing that offence. And we do have dedicated police officers who are scouring social media. Their job is to look for this material.
We've had the UK government X account saying, think before you post. Obviously, we've had these prison sentences for speech, and then there's been the decision to pause, which is to say scrap, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. So what have you made of the present government's approach to free speech? Is this the emergence of Sir Keir Starlin?
Yeah, I find it a curious situation because in my role at the Free Speech Union, I've recently been doing some research into Keir Starmer's background, his role as the Director of Public Prosecutions, and during that time he made some really encouraging. So this was 2008 to 2013. When he was the Director of Public Prosecutions, made some really encouraging statements about free speech and increasing legislation and criminalising forms of online speech. He said would lead to a chilling effect on free speech. So we need to avoid that. And skip forward 11 years, and Mr. Starmer, the DPP, has become Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and he obviously still understands these issues. But he's not willing to stand by them, or at least he's not publicly unwilling to stand by them. I think in terms of the riots, we maybe need to, in terms of some of his pronouncements in the riots, we maybe need to understand that there is a social order and a social disorder element there which needed tough talking. But I think the wider problem, as I see it, with Keir Starmer at the moment is he understands the issues. Clearly, he was a human rights lawyer. But I think one of the roles for me of a prime minister or any politician worth their salt is to understand the electorate, is to understand the public as a whole, and to be able to process negative emotions and negative reactions as well as positive ones, and process them, understand them, and speak to the concerns, however inarticulate those concerns are, speak to them. And in my view, he has singularly failed over the past few weeks to be able to do that. The riots, there's no condoning that sort of violence. There's no condoning that a lot of the things that happened. It's rioting, it's wrong, and we have laws to deal with that. But what a lot of these white working class young men are doing is inarticulately expressing, their anger at failings of the system that that they are within. They've been failed by the education system for years. They've been failed by the labour market for years. They've been failed by mass immigration policies for years. And they don't have the words to express themselves articulately. This was, if you like, this was a cry of rage, and it's wrong. But the job of a prime minister is not simply to condemn. And indeed, he didn't just condemn during the Black Lives Matter protest. He processed and he contextualised, and he said, I understand. What he's done this time is simply not listen, condemn people, talk about racists, and say there's nothing to talk about here, move on. And that's not really the job of a prime minister. And there's only so long that can work and be a viable function when there is that much anger there, particularly amongst young working class males, about, rightly or wrongly, in most cases, in my view, rightly, about the failings of a system over decades that has left them where they are. So I think we've gone away maybe from free speech issues there, but to come back to the free speech issues, what we need is people to talk about and be able to talk about these issues which are in an inarticulate and wrong way that we should condemn. But those are issues that are coming forward, and the Prime Minister's not talking about them, and a lot of other people are being punished, or at least there's a chilling effect on social media that's not enabling people to talk about these issues, mass immigration, globalization, and so on, that people are really angry about. So there is a free speech issue there as well, I think.
And indeed, it seems that when it comes to these riots, rather than talk about the underlying causes, the Liberal establishment would much rather talk about social media in general, and in particular X. And in fact, many have said that Elon Musk himself whipped up the riots and even called for his platform to be shut down. But I mean, doesn't this seem a little bit hysterical in the first place, and also like displacement activity? I mean, was it really free speech online that caused these riots?
No, I don't think it was at all. I think that the job of society as a whole is to listen to other people, and sometimes you're not going to like what you hear. And I think even in these moments of rioting, there was a message coming across that society as a whole needed to listen to. I would rather have people discussing it, and because one of the reasons, why would you rather have people discussing it? Because then you can counter things that you don't agree with. So if people are spreading conspiracy theories, if people are spreading false information, then I'd rather have people counter that. For instance, one of the great innovations that Elon Musk has brought in has been community notes. So when people make claims, you can see a community note that says, well, actually, the fact is this. So for me, I'd rather have people talking about these things than not talking about them, and speech and thought being suppressed. I don't think free speech was what caused this issue. I think people talking about it to me is a secondary process. I think this spontaneous rage that people have is driven by social conditions, cultural factors, economic factors, because rioting is not a new phenomenon. It's not concurrent with, it doesn't run concurrently with social media. There's been riots throughout modern history. So I don't think we can simply say, it might be convenient for people who don't want people to be talking about political issues that they find distasteful. It might be convenient for people who don't want us to talk about the insanity of net zero or the insanity of unfettered mass immigration to say we shouldn't have free speech. And I think they then jump on the bandwagon and say, oh, well, we've had these riots, and this is what you're going to have if you have a free speech absolutist in charge of Twitter, because people are just talking and then it foments violence. I think the violence is fomented in society. And then I think people talk about it on social media. I've not seen any, personally, I've not seen any academic research that makes a direct causal link between online speech, or indeed in-person free speech, and violence on the streets in the form of rioting.
And finally, should we be concerned that in the government's performative crackdown on the rioters, that due process is being sacrificed? I mean, in particular, there's been this tweet by the Home Office which boasts about the number of arrests since the rioting, and which describes all of those arrested, that is, prior to their being convicted, as criminals. I mean, what have you made of that?
Yeah, I mean, at the Free Speech Union, we are concerned about this. We've written to the Home Secretary to complain. There was a tweet. In fact, there's been 2 or 3 tweets on the official Home Office X account which have described people who've been arrested in connection with the disturbances following the Southport murders as criminals. Even though some of them haven't been charged, and some of those who have been charged pleaded not guilty and are awaiting trial. I mean, if you were a journalist, you described an individual who'd been arrested or charged but not yet admitted guilt, or somebody who's awaiting trial, and if you describe them as a criminal, you'd be at risk of being in contempt of court, and could be sent to prison. I'm not suggesting there's a direct read across there, but I think the Home Office needs to be much more careful with the language it uses on its social media platforms. I think, as you say, I think there's a performative element to this. I think they want to be seen to be being tough, but there is a level where they are the Home Office and they need to be careful with their language around these issues. I mean, the other thing, and we talked about this earlier, the Online Safety Act creates this false communications offence, which is potentially very vague and which is potentially open to a sort of a capacious interpretation. So the Home Office, when it's describing people who've only been arrested and it's describing them as criminals, it risks committing a false communications offence under Section 179 of the Online Safety Act. So, if Yvette Cooper's office posted a message conveying information it knew to be false, but it is so. If it knew that not all those arrested in connection are in fact criminals and don't have criminal records, but then a decision was made at the social media level to post that anyway with the intent of causing, quote, non-trivial psychological harm, which is the phrase in the Online Safety Act, to a, quote, likely audience, which again is the vague phrase in the Online Safety Act, then she, as the person ultimately responsible for what's posted on X by the Home Office, might be guilty of a criminal offence. It's arguable. The language is so loose that is now an arguable thing. And this was always one of the problems that we talked about with the Online Safety Act. Once you start talking about things like non-trivial psychological harm and the idea of false communication offences, you do open up a lot of what people say in everyday life, social media policies, even the Home Office now, what they say, what they tweet, what they post is potentially caught within this new legislation, or at least it's arguable that it could be. And I guess that's a problem for the law when we get into that type of situation.
Okay, well, Dr. Freddie Attenborough, thanks very much for coming on.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, we heard there about how the elites are so unwilling to talk about the immigration issue that they'd rather censor the internet. And another favoured tactic is to try and claim that the historically unprecedented levels of immigration and ethnic change that we're witnessing is actually somehow normal in our history. BBC Horrible Histories, for instance, erroneously informs its young viewers that black Britons have been here from the start. The Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, claims that London was built by refugees, and we're constantly told online that because of the Vikings, the Normans, or the Huguenots, that Britain has always been a nation of immigrants. But how true is that? Well, to find out, I'm very pleased to be joined now by the writer and commentator Andy Collingwood, who's also co-host of the Multipolarity Podcast. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Andy.
Thanks for having me back.
Now, Andy, you've written recently kind of correcting the record here on both the history of immigration to Britain and the history of the British and the English as an ethnic group. Now, what are you saying in that article? Have we always been a nation of immigrants?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do in my article, Laurie, was to show that Britain has not always been a nation of migrants. And in fact, there are few nations to which that would be that label would be less appropriately applied to. If you look at the genetic record of Britain, about 3/4 of modern day Britons were here 6,000 years ago, deep into prehistoric Britain. And actually, Sir Walter Bodmer, who is an extraordinarily well-regarded and well-respected geneticist, said that the extraordinary thing about Britain is just how stable it's been and how stable the British population has been. He showed essentially that Britain hasn't changed much genetically since about 600 AD. So this is like a long time ago. I mean, 600 AD, that, you know, it's the thick end of a millennia before the foundation of the Aztec civilization. It's the thick end of half a millennia before Genghis Khan. It's around the time of the Mayan civilization. I mean, this is a long time ago. And essentially, all of the invasions into Britain, the Normans, the Vikings, and during the Danelaw period, the Saxons, the Frisians, the Anglo, all of those invasions essentially put a thin veneer over the genetic record of Britain. Like the vast bulk has been very stable since the Dark Ages. So it's very strange to say that Britain has always been a nation of migrants, Laurie, because I guess if you have to go back to the Dark Ages for actual armed invasions that put very little into the genetic record itself and call that justification for Britain being a nation of migrants, I think really you're serving up very thin gruel. And even a little bit of thinking about this shows that it's a ridiculous statement. I understand why people might want to argue that if they're in favor of high migration, or if maybe they're not in favor of high migration and would like current migrants, either first, second, third generation, to feel comfortable in the country. But the fact is, it's simply not true, I'm afraid.
Okay, so there's the English as a stable ethnic group that you talk about there in your article. And then you also talk about the history of immigration to Britain since the 1940s. Can you just take us through that history?
Well, before the end of the Second World War, there was no real concept of a British citizen. What was a British citizen? It simply didn't exist as a concept in law. We were all subject to the crown, and that extended throughout the empire, whether you're in Jamaica or Britain or Kenya or India. But obviously after the war, you have a series of independence movements, most prominently India. But you also have certain colonies and dominions changing their ideas. For instance, Canada introduced the concept of a Canadian citizen. So there was a need for the British government to address some of these changes and face up to the reality. And they introduced the Nationality Act of 1948. And that essentially put somebody from Kingston, Jamaica, on the same standing in terms of their right to live and work in the UK as somebody from Kingston upon Thames. The government at the time, British politicians, British elites, had very little idea about how large the influx was going to be. If you look at the cabinet papers in the National Archives, we see that for the first few years, numbers were only about 2,000 coming from the dominions and Commonwealth and former empire. But by 1961, that had increased to 135,000 people a year. By the mid-60s or late 60s, there was well over 1 million people in the UK, non-white people of different cultures and quite often entirely different religions as well, living in the United Kingdom. And the numbers had been so large that integration was impossible. Before 1945 and before these large numbers, Britain had actually been extraordinarily successful at integrating migrants. We can all think of examples, people like Holst, for example, Winston Churchill, of these second generation migrants who, or even first in some senses, who had arrived and who had become, for all intents and purposes, English. Benjamin Disraeli is another one. But after that, the numbers were so large that it, by necessity, created communities that retained their original culture, which ran in parallel to the host culture. And in the late 60s, there were two competing ideas of how to deal with this. One was Roy Jenkins, who listeners will be well aware of, quite a serious intellect, a liberal, something of an elitist, a superb politician. He argued that actually integration from now on, what it should mean is not this idea of flattening all cultures to produce people who were roughly the same, but an idea of multiple cultures living alongside each other in kind of civilized toleration of each other's cultures. And this is the idea, this is the seed of multiculturalism. This is what multiculturalism is in the British sense. It's not multiracialism. It's entirely possible to think of a monocultural country that contains within it different races. However, that's not what multiculturalism was about, and I think people get confused. The idea was that Britain from now wouldn't have a single culture, British culture or English culture. It would be multicultural. There would be British culture, but alongside that, running in parallel, would be, say, Pakistani Muslim culture, an Indian Hindu or Indian Sikh culture, and so on and so forth. Now, competing with this was Enoch Powell, who I'm sure listeners will be aware of for his notoriety, and specifically the so-called Rivers of Blood speech, which certainly contained disgraceful and incendiary language, but it also presented the alternative, which was this idea that we would stop migration altogether and couple that perhaps with voluntary repatriation, so that Britain could then concentrate on integrating those few that were left and would maintain its culture. And Powell believed this was necessary because of the extensive time that he had spent in India, which he had loved, but had been appalled by the inter-ethnic violence there, which was extreme in the 1940s and 1950s, as everyone knows. But also a visit in 1967 to the United States, which was at the time racked with violence between African Americans and the authorities, and especially a riot, I believe he had seen at the Democratic National Conference in Detroit. And he believed that if Britain pursued this concept of multiculturalism, which he saw as happening de facto, it would inevitably lead to ethnic conflict of a similar nature in Britain. What happened after that was Powell was very quickly defenestrated from British politics or mainstream British politics. But at the same time, the Labour government at the time quietly passed an act, which was followed up by subsequent acts of Conservative governments to restrict migration. And these series of acts were quite successful in doing that. But in 1997, the Labour government came in and engaged in a deliberate campaign to massively increase migration. It's well known what they did with the EU. Listeners who would like more details can go and read my article about what they did with the EU and the miscalculations there, where they said that, from the new former Soviet nations coming into the EU, only 5,000 to 13,000 migrants would come to Britain every year, and it ended up being 72,000 a year, for example. But what's less known is they also did the same from outside the EU. So they removed the primary purpose rule, which basically the primary purpose rule asked people who were getting married to foreigners to provide proof that the marriage wasn't undertaken simply to gain British residency. So they removed the primary purpose rule. They removed exit checks for visas. They increased the number of student visas. They relaxed work requirements. They offered post-study work visas, which have become an issue yet again. And they did all of these things like 1 year after the other, 97, 98, 99, 2000. And this, combined with the EU migration, just exploded the number of immigrants coming into Britain, which was a big driver in Brexit. And after Brexit, of course, you had Boris Johnson's government, which also increased migration somehow. And, even people like Jonathan Portes are saying that Britain has one of the most liberal immigration policies in the world, and that EU migration, which had been running at 150,000 or so, had been more than made up for by migration from outside the UK. And Mr. Portes is obviously very much in favour of high migration. So this is a kind of potted history of what happened in the UK, what I described in my article. And what that's led to is a situation where in 1951, 0.1% of people living in the United Kingdom were non-white British people. So they were not white British people. 0.1% were not white British people. Just 3 generations later, like 64, 66 years later, that figure is now 1/4 of people living. So in just 3 generations, you've had this absolutely enormous change in the demography of the nation. And for good or for bad, I pass no judgment. I have my own opinions, but in the article, I pass no judgment. That's simply been unpopular. And it's been a driver of sentiment like that, which kind of exploded into violence after the Southport tragedy.
Okay, so one of the justifications for these large increases in immigration, especially recently, is to say that we've always been like this, essentially. And people say this of America, that it's a propositional nation, it's an idea, and in the early 20th century it was supposed to be this melting pot. And similarly, since Blair, we now hear about this idea of British values as almost the without which not of British identity. Would you say that there's a problem with the Americanization of British immigration discourse?
Well, I mean, broadly, Laurie, I think there's a problem with the Americanization of British political discourse, full stop. We seem to import America's political pathologies unquestioningly. There are a whole range of instances of this. I'm sure listeners will be aware of them, but specifically on immigration, I think that is in fact true. And I think that was perhaps, I don't want to dip into psychology here because nobody can read minds. I think, though, that it's certainly true that the first Blair ministry was packed with people who really liked America. They really liked the political system of America, the constitutional system of America, and perhaps sort of superior to the British system. We see a range of quite serious constitutional changes undertaken by those first 2 ministries, whether it be things like making the central bank independent or introducing the Supreme Court, which are very American in their position. Blair's style of government, in which he made Alistair Campbell a kind of de facto chief of staff, the kind of the Leo McGarry figure for West Wing folks, and he excluded civil service. He wasn't a big fan of Parliament. He very much pursued a presidential style of government. And if you read about people like Gordon Brown, for example, Gordon Brown is, I think it would be fair to say, he's like something of an amateur expert in American political history, American history and American politics. There was, when he was prime minister, there was a story in Time magazine which described how Gordon Brown felt extremely comfortable in America. He took his holidays in Aspen in Colorado, where he engaged with the local political scene. And he was known for going around bookstores in the, as the Americans say, in the DuPont Circle, which is one of the areas of Washington, D.C., and just emptying bookshops of their books about American history and American politics and political figures. So I think it's fair to say that the idea that Britain could be a nation of immigrants, and America is undoubtedly a nation of immigrants. By its very nature, it's a nation of immigrants. That's 100% true, and it's undeniable. But of course, as we've seen, it's not true of Britain. But I suppose that the idea that Britain could be a nation of immigrants, and we would have, interesting Italian Americans and Jewish, or Italian Britons and Jewish Britons and Irish Britons, and in the same way that you have these quite vibrant communities on the east coast of America, would be potentially very attractive to these people who really liked America, really liked its political system, and really liked its constitutional and cultural makeup as well.
Okay, so if the mainstream thinking about British identity is essentially wrong here, and it misconceives or misrepresents our identity and history, what are the consequences of that for British society?
The United States as a polity, as a constitutional system, as a nation itself, it is set up to be a nation of migrants. It has a whole series of policies. You mentioned in an earlier question, for example, the melting pot. Okay, now the melting pot wasn't this idea of having like a really big pot of different cultures and the pot itself would make this like the soup of the nation. No, the melting pot idea was this idea that you would go into the pot as an Italian or a Pole or a Swede, and you would be melted down essentially, and you would come out as like an ingot of American. That was the melting pot. It was actually quite a serious and aggressive way of integrating people to make them feel like Americans. Like in schools, they studied American history. They didn't study history, but they studied American history. So, at the start of every school day, they pledged allegiance to the flag. Now, you put a system where everyone thinks we're a nation of migrants, so we should invite people in the same way that the Americans do. Give us your poor, your needy, you're wretched, and you invite them into a system that's not designed to do that in the way that American has, and it's not going to work out in the same way. There are going to be external and non-linear results there that don't go well. It's exactly the same as listeners will be very aware of the difference between civil law and British common law, for example, and the effect of having EU acquis based on this foreign system of law that has supremacy ultimately per the Treaty of Rome over British law, and the effect and the kind of insidious effect that that's had on the nation. Well, it's the same thing here essentially. So I think there are effects of just getting this wrong. First of all, in terms of the way people think and the way people set policy, and also in the way that Britain just isn't set up in the same way as America, so we can't do the same things and expect the same results.
Okay, well, Andy Collingwood, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you again for having me.
Now, when it comes to climate change and Britain's net zero policy, skeptics are often told not to rock the boat, to follow the science, and to let the experts get on with whatever they think is best. But what if the experts we're being led by aren't all they're cracked up to be? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined again on The Sceptic by David Turver, author of the Eigen Values substack and a regular Daily Sceptic contributor. Welcome to The Sceptic, David.
Hello. Good to be back.
Okay, so David, you've been lifting the lid in some of your recent articles on what's really going on in net zero land. Now, the Climate Change Committee has recently delivered its 2024 progress report to Parliament. Now, before we get into some of the details of that report, can you just tell us a bit about, what is the Climate Change Committee? Who are these people, and what are they up to?
Well, the Climate Change Committee was established as a result of the Climate Change Act, and their job is to ostensibly to hold the government account for achieving its climate goals, but in practice, it's more like forcing the government to do what it wants to do what the Climate Change Committee wants it to do. I did another piece a few months ago now where Lord Debon, the outgoing chairman, was crowing about, in effect, how unaccountable they are. And if the government doesn't want to do what the Climate Change Committee wants it to do, then it has to come crawling cap in hand to the Climate Change Committee and ask for permission. In essence, the carbon budgets that the Climate Change Committee produces are enshrined in law, and we have to follow them. So I guess the most latest one was the sixth carbon budget, and that's got some relation to what we're about to talk about, because they made some predictions in there which are not coming true.
Okay, so there's been this recent progress report from the Climate Change Committee, and it starts by talking about electricity. So what's it saying about the state of electricity generation in Britain, and what it would like to happen, and what's actually happening?
Well, they've produced this progress report, and they're sort of full of sound and fury, saying that we're not on track to hit the target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. And in a sort of like, they've got sort of like a quasi-religious 10 commandments in the report. The first one of which is make electricity cheaper, which I couldn't help but think and chuckle to myself that it was almost Trumpian of make electricity cheap again. But they're trying to wriggle out from the recommendations that they've made themselves over the past decade or so, insisting that renewables are cheaper and we've got to have more of them. And now they seem to have realized that having all these renewables is making our electricity more expensive. So they just want the government to wave a magic wand and make electricity cheap again. They aren't explicit on exactly how the government should do that, which is interesting in itself. But in recent weeks, the National Grid ESO made the explicit call for the levies, which is another word for subsidies, on our electricity bills to be rebalanced onto gas. There are other industry commentators asking to do that as well, although some say that they should be taking off electricity and just incorporate in general taxation, because that's more progressive. I think the more progressive thing will probably be to not have them at all, but that's a different argument. So, in essence, they've acknowledged that electricity prices have risen, and of course, this rise in electricity prices acts as a barrier to two of the other things that they wanted to do, which is to use electric vehicles and to install heat pumps. So, the only way that they can make those things appear to work is if electricity is dirt cheap. But of course it isn't dirt cheap because we've got renewables, yet they want even more renewables, and then they're trying to hide the cost of them. This is the same Climate Change Committee that in its sixth carbon budget suggested that offshore wind could fall to as low as £23 per megawatt hour by 2050. That's roughly a third of what market prices of electricity are today, and less than a quarter of what is being offered in allocation round 6 or AR6.
Right, okay, so that brings me nicely onto my next question. So for the layman, what are these allocation rounds and what's the significance of them?
Allocation rounds are a means of the government auctioning off renewables capacity. They used to be every couple of years, but more recently they come every year. So last year was what's called allocation round 5 or AR5, which was a spectacular failure because they weren't offering enough money for offshore wind in particular. AR6 is this year, and the as I mentioned, the auction is going on right now. It started today, the 5th of August, and runs till Friday. And the Climate Change Committee, somewhat euphemistically, asks for these upcoming CFD auctions to be designed, effectively designed, by which they mean let's have lots of capacity. They suggest that volume should be prioritized over price. And in fact, since that report came out, Ed Miliband has boosted the budget for AR6 by it's about a third, I think a little bit more than a third, from just over $1 billion to just over 1.5 billion. And I mean, the Climate Change Committee has the brass neck to claim that the cost of key low carbon technologies is falling, whereas they put in a 60% increase on offshore wind and increases on onshore wind and large-scale solar. The Labour government is also pushing floating offshore wind, which is even more expensive. They're offering something like £246 a megawatt hour for that, all of which are more expensive than our current gas-fired electricity price, which is, of course, it goes up and down, but it's about £65 a megawatt hour at the moment, and that includes carbon taxes that we've put on there, and the fact that our gas and continental European gas is getting on for 6 times more expensive than gas in the USA. And the key issue that we face is that our energy, both electricity and gas and other forms of energy, is simply too expensive, which is why we're seeing deindustrialization, which I guess we'll come to in a moment.
Okay, so let's now get on to some of the implications for British industry. I mean, British industry is already feeling the pinch from our sky-high electricity prices. And now the Climate Change Committee says it wants to accelerate the electrification of industrial heat. Now, what will be the consequences of that?
Well, lots of industry, particularly things like chemicals, they need heat to make their processes work. And the cheapest way of doing that certainly has been using gas. It's very flexible. You can generate high temperatures, and until recently, gas has been very cheap. But of course, burning gas creates carbon dioxide emissions. So the policy wonks in the Climate Change Committee and other places want us to electrify industrial heat. So that's always bound to be more expensive than using gas. Because if you think about using gas to produce electricity, you lose about half of the energy as waste heat to produce electricity. So the electricity produced from gas is always going to be at least twice as expensive as the gas that it comes from. And of course, if we use renewables to produce electricity, despite their protestations to the contrary, they are, as we demonstrated earlier, the renewables are more expensive than gas. So they want support to be made available, which is, I guess, a code word for subsidies, but they also want to increase the price of carbon. So the charge that they put for emitting CO2, they want that to go up to essentially price gas out of the market. So to make using gas more expensive than using electricity. And then, which of course is going to be crippling for energy intensive industries, because if that's say 80% of their cost or more than half their cost, then if you put up the largest cost element, then that's going to make you stupendously uncompetitive on the market, on the international markets. So to combat that, they want to introduce what's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which is our version of what the European Union is trying to do as well, which is essentially a carbon tax on imports. So if we want to import steel, which of course made from coal, or it might be made from, in the electric arc process, it might be made from electricity that's come from coal, then they want to put a carbon tax on those imports in order to allegedly protect industry and protect against offshoring. I don't think it will do either. So if you're running an energy-intensive industry in this country and your energy is very expensive, then if you try and export, then you're not going to be able to compete on markets because your products are too expensive. So instead of decarbonizing, you're going to dematerialize and go to a place with cheaper energy. And in fact, Sir Jim Ratcliffe said as much in a recent interview with The Times, I think it was a few weeks ago, where he said UK energy was 5 times more expensive than America, and the chemicals industry in this country is finished. So they're trying to make up for the fact that all these renewables that they say are cheap are in fact more expensive, and in the process destroying our industry. As I said before, it's a recipe for industry dematerialization, not decarbonization. Pardon me. We're seeing that already with the closure of the Port Talbot Steelworks. Last year, we lost our last fertilizer plant. So now we can no longer make virgin steel, and we can't make fertilizer fertilizer fields to grow our own food. I would argue that makes us not a serious country.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not like we're not using any of these things, right? It's just that we're getting other people to make them and then shipping them across the world.
Yes, and emitting carbon dioxide gases as they do that, indeed. And those countries probably have lower environmental standards than we have too. So in terms of SOx and NOx emissions, which particulates, which are harmful.
Yeah. Okay, so finally on the Climate Change Committee, Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, did actually push back a handful of our net zero measures on gas spoilers and electric cars. Now, in fact, these were rather piddling measures, but how did they react to that?
Well, it appears as though they're furious. They had the temerity to push back even slightly against the agenda, and they are insisting that the new government brings them back in the original form. And it appears as though Ed Miliband is going to follow that. I'm not sure if it's gone into legislation yet, but they've certainly said that they're going to reintroduce the ban on the sale of new internal combustion engine cars by 2030, and they're making noises about reversing Rishi Sunak's U-turn. So I guess that makes it a donut or something.
Yes. Okay, so let's turn to another of your recent pieces, which was on the Digest of UK Energy Statistics annual data, which was also released recently. Now, people might not pay very much attention to this, but this is actually something that's very, very important. I mean, so what is this report saying? How much energy we're using and where are we getting it from?
The Digest of UK Energy Statistics was released a couple of weeks ago. It's quite depressing reading. Overall energy demand dropped to levels last seen in the 1950s, and industrial and household use of energy dropped to the lowest level in over 50 years. Now, 50 years ago was the dark time of the 3-day week, which you probably won't remember, Laurie, but I do remember it. I was a kid at the time, going out to collect firewood because the coal couldn't be delivered. At the time of the 3-day week, companies were forced to close down for 4 days of the week, and they could only operate 3 days a week because there was a shortage of electricity because the miners were on strike. Today, we're doing that a different way in that the state is essentially mandating that electricity is effectively rationed by what they euphemistically call the demand-side response, where large users are paid to turn off their operations at times of high overall demand. The other depressing thing about that is that our import dependency went up to about just short of 41%, up 3.8% from 2022. So despite falling energy demand, we were reliant on a higher proportion of our overall energy coming from abroad. Now that's both oil and gas because the North Sea is in decline, but our electricity imports reached a record high too, which sort of blows out of the water the government's claims that renewables make us more secure. If we're more reliant upon imports from abroad, then our energy security is in the hands of the kindness of strangers.
I mean, so it seems that if the people in charge of our energy policy had just looked at the technicalities of the Duke's report, as you have, then they'd be able to see quite clearly that there's a big problem on the horizon here. And so it leaves you wondering, who are the people in charge of our energy policy at places like the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero? Now, I know that you've been looking into this a bit, David. What have you found?
Okay, well, I guess if we start with the ministers, there's 6 new ministers in the department. And if you look at their background and experience, there's 2 with PPE degrees, 1 with a degree in history, another with a degree in political studies, 1 with a degree in history and political studies, and finally there's another one with a degree in Russian or Russian studies. So not a single one of them has got any background in science or engineering or maths, and almost all of them have worked in the public sector for their whole lives. So between them there's precious little experience of the commercial world and no experience of the energy sector. One of the ministers, Miata Fanbule, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, has qualifications in economics, but she describes herself as a heterodox economist, and she's advocated flooding the market with cheaper renewables and introducing free basic energy, without really explaining how more expensive, how we can flood the market with cheap renewables when they're more expensive, nor who's going to pay for this free energy. So that's quite heterodox economics for you. The SPADs, there are 3 SPADs. One studied history at Cambridge, the other one studied law at City, and then went on to study at Harvard, and came up with a thesis on a just transition to a fairer economy, Labour's plan for a green industrial revolution. And the final SPAD, we're not quite sure what her degree is, but she writes for The Guardian, and apparently in another publication said she was particularly focused on integrating nature into the climate offer. So no evidence of STEM background amongst the SPADs. Now, some people might say, well, it doesn't matter. The ministers are just there to oversee department, and it's really the civil servants that run the show. There are 7 senior civil servants listed on the DESNE's website. And if you look at their background, a similar picture emerges. There's degrees in modern history, geography, modern languages, but precious little evidence of a STEM background anywhere. Only the chief scientific advisor has any sort of science background, and he's a chemist with a special focus on astrochemistry. So if we want to get our energy from Alpha Centauri, then he's our man. There's no evidence of any significant experience outside the public sector, and no experience of proper commercial businesses in any sector, let alone energy. And then you think, well, who might the department turn to? They could turn to the National Grid ESO, who recently published their Future Energy Pathways, and the lady who, their policy director, the lady Claire Dichter, who oversaw that work and wrote the foreword, describes herself as a leading influencer in the energy industry, as though she were running a TikTok channel. She graduated from Aston with a degree in management, business and law, so no evidence of experience of a STEM background either, although she has been with the National Grid for, I think, a couple of decades. They might look to the Climate Change Committee, which is currently without a chairman and without a CEO, but the former chairman, Lord Debon, also known as John Selwyn Gummer, has a degree in history. The former CEO, Chris Stark, who's now the head of mission control in the Department of Energy, he's got a degree in finance and law. And it was rumoured in the Times that Emma Pinchbeck, who's currently the CEO of Energy UK, which is really a renewables cheerleader, is going to take over as the CEO of the Climate Change Committee. Emma's got a classics degree from Oxford and began her career as a climate campaigner with the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So not much evidence of STEM, engineering or energy experience, or indeed proper commercial experience. Of course, the CCC does have some engineers and scientists on the board, but I did another piece there, and quite a few of them have obviously drunk the Kool-Aid, and a lot of their funding is dependent upon the kindness of billionaire climate activists. So it appears that Madame Miliband has no clothes, and his entire entourage have net zero garments, as you might say. So we're being led by people who just fundamentally do not understand the sector.
Worrying stuff. Okay, well, David Turver, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Laurie.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.